Now, speaking about inspiring women in our field, it is now my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Guyonne Kalb, who is a professorial fellow in the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research at the University of Melbourne. Guyonne has been a valued member of the WEN community and participant at several of our Australian gender economics workshops. She has made rich contributions to economic research in the fields of women's labour force participation and gender equality, as well as labour market, social security policies and taxation, child development, and other dimensions of disadvantage and inequality. In her service and leadership to the profession, Professor Kalb is a chief investigator at the ARC Life Course Centre, a research fellow of the IZA, and a co-editor of the Economic Record. Her work extends to numerous projects that generate evidence for policy making, including conducting major evaluations of the Australian government's paid parental leave scheme. If I could sum up her contribution, I would say she epitomises what it means to use our economics expertise for good, channeling it towards meaningful real-world outcomes. Professor Kalb's keynote address is sponsored by the Australian Government Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Productivity Commission, and the Economic Society of Australia ACT branch. Now, you will have the opportunity to ask questions by typing in your question in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. You can also give a thumbs up to upvote your favourite questions. Thank you, everyone, and it is now my pleasure to welcome to the virtual stage our opening keynote speaker, Professor Guyonne Kalb.
Thank you, Leonora. That was a fabulous introduction, and it really perfectly sets the scene for what I'm wanting to talk about today. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for the invitation. I feel very honored to be able to present to you here today. And I would like to say that the organizers have done a fabulous job in seamlessly transitioning from a hybrid conference to a fully online conference. And the program looks really very interesting and engaging. And it will be a full 2 days, which I'm very much looking forward to. Before starting my presentation, I would like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which we are meeting today. And I would like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. The lands that I'm presenting from are the lands from the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So I'll try and share my screen. I'll just take a moment to do that and concentrate on that, always a challenge. Oh, sorry, this is the wrong one, I think. Sorry about that. Okay, I think that should be working. Sorry, I'm not very good technologically, so that's really not my strong point, but it's working. So today I would like to talk about the importance of policies that enable families to better balance family and work, and to generally share their caring roles and paid work roles. The title of my presentation is perhaps a little provocative, but I do believe that women who have children are definitely more at risk than men of financial vulnerability later in life. And I think that Australia can do much better in supporting young families, and believe that in doing so, this would have benefits for many parts of society. And so I really want to sort of spend some time today on looking at research that can hopefully assist us in doing so. So the work I will be talking about will benefit from several collaborations that I've had over the years with many people, and the publications that I include in my presentation today have benefited from the authors that you can see on this slide. So as I mentioned, the title is perhaps a little provocative, but older women are a major group at risk of homelessness and or financial vulnerability. So the media has sort of spent some attention on this in the last few years. And then you look at the sort of factors that lead up to this, having children and associated career breaks are major factors in this vulnerability. And that's not acceptable. This risk could not be borne by women alone. We can do better in Australia in sharing the load of caring and paid work. I think it's also important to emphasize, as Leonora also did, that it's not just about women. It's about everyone contributing to better work-family balance. And the right policies will benefit women, men, children, families, and society more generally, both economically and socially. And so this is really a growing area of research. And when you do a literature review, you'll find many papers on this topic, on related topics. But I would really like to see even more effort directed towards these topics, and maybe with a particular focus on Australia to really help policymakers make decisions about policies going forward that will actually help us achieve this. We need to understand some of the relationships perhaps better, and we need to test the impact of new policies. So when we come up with new policy design, we really need to look at what it does in practice. And if it's sort of not performing the way we hoped it would, we should look at how we can fine-tune the policy to sort of perform better. And that way we can design policies that will achieve better outcomes for all in the future. And so before I sort of go into looking at some of the papers that I've done a little bit of research for this, specific for this presentation as well. So I want you to show how sharing is not working at the moment. And I guess you probably all know this, but I always find it very powerful to just see a few graphs of what it looks like. So what I want to do is to show the lifetime patterns of hours worked, the hours spent on caring for a child, hours on all inside housework, and hours on outside housework. And do this separately for men and women who started parenthood at different ages. So I'll use Hilda data, perhaps not surprising for someone coming from the Melbourne Institute. And I will graph the outcomes by age with separate lines for men and women without children, and then women who had children by the age of 19 or between the ages of 20 to 24, etc. So this is purely descriptive. It's just sort of looking at the raw data. And I should thank HAVU for sort of collaborating with me on a teenage mothers paper, which generated this data code that I've adapted to generate these graphs, which I personally really like. I think they're very illustrative. So when we look at the average hours per week in paid work, the women are on the left-hand side and the men are on the right-hand side. We can see that as children arrive, the women's labor supply goes down. This is not surprising, but it's really very, very clear. So we can see sort of the patterns for men and women are quite similar up to the point where the first child arrives. So I guess that what we see in today's world is that women participate in the labor force like men up to the point that children arrive. So that's really the crucial turning point that things start changing. And so for men, not much is happening, so it doesn't really matter. I mean, the lines are not exactly the same, but there are no breaking points at the time that children are arriving in fathers' lives. Very naturally, the average hours per week that you spend in caring for children is obviously 0 before you have your first child, and then it goes up very quickly. It does go up for men as well, but when you sort of pay attention to the y-axis and the scale on it, you can see that women spend more than twice as much time caring for children per week than men do. Then we go to the average hours per week in all housework. So that's basically all inside housework chores, but also running errands, like doing shopping and things like that. So what we see there is a very similar pattern to this childcare, although obviously less child, because everyone participates in housework before children arrive, but we see a very clear increase at the point in time that children arrive, and also just before it. And that's partly to do with young people sort of moving out of their parental homes into their own households and taking responsibility for their own housekeeping. But when children arrived, the increase is very markedly for women, nothing for men. And again, when we look at the y-axis, we can see there's a very different scale. Women do more than twice, maybe even 3 times as much as men. And this again is sort of reinforced by the arrival of children. When we look at the average hours per week in outside housework, because sometimes it's argued that men do more of the outside housework, women do more of the inside housework. Well, this is true, but the difference between men and women is not as large as on the inside housework, on the caring housework, on the caring for children roles. So when you add up all these different hours, women are sort of doing way more than men around the house, and especially so when children arrive. At the same time, they've reduced their hours of work, which is not surprising because you only have a limited number of hours per week that you have available. So that means that there's a really clear connection between sort of the having of children, the career breaks, and that is part of the reason that women sort of have worse outcomes down the track in terms of economic security. So when we look at sort of labor force participation over time, we can see that this is really very clearly increasing. And so it's been a steady increase over the past four decades at least, as depicted in this graph. So I'm sure that many of you have seen this graph before from the ABS data. When you compare these numbers, I mean, they have increased substantially, and the gap between men and women is much smaller, but it's still substantial. And when you compare to other countries, like, for example, Scandinavian countries, Australia has much lower female labor force participation rates than those countries. And so that sort of really reinforces the idea that Australians could and should do better in sharing paid work and care work. And doing so would have benefits for individuals. And this would be both for men who can participate more in caring roles and build stronger relationships with their children and others, and for women who can ensure that they're more financially secure, independently of their partner. So that when a relationship breaks down, they don't end up in poverty because of their inability to re-enter the workforce or re-enter at a level that would allow them to earn a reasonable wage. Families would also benefit, including children. Families would sort of be more financially secure as two earners, and the families would benefit from a great role of male partners in family life, which I think is really important and often isn't talked about that much. It's nice perhaps here to mention a research insight that was published by Barbara Broadway last year, where she looks in the COVID period at men's mental health and compares that with the pre-COVID period. And what she finds is that post-COVID, men's mental health is affected by the partner's employment. So men who have a partner who is jobless are at higher risk of poor mental health. They're more likely to be mentally distressed. And so it appears that economic uncertainty makes the male breadwinnership sort of more stressful for men. And so this is something that it's a very early finding and would be really interesting to look into more into the future. And I think it could be another argument why it's really important to try and share paid work, caring work. Society more broadly would also benefit. if there's a lower risk of needing to provide income support after relationships break down, that clearly has a benefit in terms of lower expenditures on income support. But it also means higher productivity and economic growth through the higher participation rates that you're achieving because you're sharing the paid work more equally. So what's needed to sort of achieve this ideal world? So when you think about what's needed, you really need actions by various parts of society. So government clearly has a role through family-friendly policies and providing support when that's needed. Employers also are very important, obviously, in encouraging female labor supply by providing flexible work arrangements and policies which can be truly accessed by both men and women. And so we really need to think about family-friendly policies as something for everyone, not just for women. And men and women themselves, every person in Australia can contribute to this by more equal sharing of paid work and caring work. And so we need to understand what works already, and what does not work. And so in my view, it's very important to have publicly available evaluations of policies that are informing, I guess, the government, but also the public more broadly. And I think this is where a very clear role for us economists lies. We can contribute to these policies. And I think it's really important that we do, and that we try to evaluate new policies the best way we can, even if it's perhaps not to the high ideals of absolute certainty around causality, because I don't think that really exists. But I think it's really important to assess new policies that have been introduced the best way we can, given the circumstances they have been introduced in, and to try and really understand what impact they have, so that we can make sure that money that's being spent is spent wisely. And so policy should not really be about forcing people to do something, but about making socially desirable choices easier, or in some cases, I would say, making them feasible. So when we look at sort of the current situation, for some women, returning to work after having a child can be very difficult, either because of financial reasons or due to lack of support, like local high-quality childcare. And these short-term difficulties can then lead to poorer long-term outcomes when you think about career breaks sort of having longer-term impacts on a woman's career. So when you think about this, you should think about this as an investment in young families now that is going to reap benefits in the long term. And trying to switch your sort of mindset to that, I think, will help assess whether something is financially viable or not. If you just look at sort of investment as current expenditure and don't look at the returns that it brings down the track, then you're not making the best choices. So for families, of course, who don't wish to share care and paid work, we could maybe think of standard arrangements to compensate the carer in case of partnership breakup. At the moment, when a relationship breaks up, child support is paid, but usually there's not a payment for the person who's been caring for the children. And the argument is that everyone can sort of enter the labor force and earn their own living. But when someone has been out of the labor market for a long time, perhaps there should be some compensation for their investment in the family during those years. And I don't really know what form that could take, but I think that is something to perhaps think about. So to sort of be able to design policies or to improve policies, you really need to understand the issues and what works. That's where research comes in and is really important. So I would like to share some of my and others' previous research on a couple of topics. So paid parental leave, which is something that I'm very passionate about, and I was very privileged to be able to be part of a team that did the evaluation of the paid parental leave that was introduced in Australia in 2011. And I think that's an example of a policy that was really properly evaluated and I think has reaped a lot of benefits. I also want to talk about some of the research that I've done on childcare and labor supply, but very briefly, and labor supply more generally. And maybe spend a few moments on the gendered impacts of COVID-19, which have been very clear, I think, and several people have written about it. And if I have time, talk a bit about work in progress that I'm currently working on, impact of divorce separation and the impact of introducing 3-year-old kinder in Victoria, whether that might sort of complement the childcare. So the Universal Paid Parental Leave was a project that I worked on together with Barbara Broadway, Duncan McVicker and Bill Martin, and a very large team of other people who worked on different aspects of Universal Paid Parental Leave. We focused on the labour market outcomes of this policy. So in 2011, as some of you may remember, the paid parental leave was introduced, which provided universal paid leave for women and their partners after having a child. And so this introduction in 2011 provided a unique opportunity to improve our understanding of the impact of such a policy. And the data that we were looking at were specifically collected for the purpose of the evaluation. And so what this paper added, I guess, first of all, it added information specifically for Australia, but it also added evidence on the new introduction of short leave with moderate payment. So compared to Europe, the Australian paid parental leave was very, very modest, both in duration and in generosity of payment. And so what we wanted to look at was the effects on duration until return to work, and then job retention and wage and hours worked. We also added some evidence on heterogeneous effects, so not just looking at the overall impact, but trying to look at the impact for separate groups. So women with lower income, higher income, women with lower, higher education, women who already had access to paid parental leave to their employers, etc. So this research was not quasi-experimental because it was introduced to everyone at the same point in time. But we did do a careful checking of confounding factors and chose time points as close as possible to the introduction of the paid parental leave. And so for those of you who are not that familiar with the Australian schemes beforehand, so we didn't have a universal paid leave scheme. And we were, with the US, the only sort of first world country that didn't have that type of arrangement. And we did have unpaid leave with a job guarantee for 1 year if you work with the employer for at least 12 months. And so there was paid leave available to some women, which was provided by employers. But that was only if it was negotiated between the employer and the employee. And mostly it was only available to high-paid, high-qualified women and in the public sector. So when we look at the percentage of women who are covered by such payments, there was a real difference between different groups of women. And so the more advantaged women tended to have access to this, but the more disadvantaged women who might be in stronger need for this type of arrangement were not eligible. So after 1st of January, there was a universal coverage after the cutoff date, which was payable to the primary care, but it could be transferred to their partner if they wished so. So the duration was 18 weeks at the minimum wage, which is relatively short and a moderate payment. And basically it can be claimed at any point in the 12 months after birth. So women who already had employer paid leave could sort of start this paid leave after the employer paid leave, for example. So the conditions of it were not very stringent, so it really made it widely available to women who had been working before their first child or the second child, or before the child was born. They only needed to have worked for at least 10 months and 330 hours in the 30 months before birth. So you didn't need to have a full-time job to be able to apply for this. The eligibility sort of was for women who had taxable income under 150,000 per year. And so women over that amount weren't eligible, which is also a difference with a lot of other countries in Europe where eligibility is really across the board. So the data was collected in a way that the women before the PPL was introduced didn't know that PPL was going to be introduced. And so we sort of collected the data in October, November 2010 for women who had given birth 1 year ago and who at the time of conception didn't have any info about paid parental leave, so were not influenced by it in any way. So then we looked at the women who would have fulfilled the work conditions, and so they would have been eligible if the scheme had been in place, and interviewed them about their experiences. We then did the same for women who gave birth in October, November 2011, who had full information about PPL at the time, and looked at their experiences and compared these two. So doing so, I think the most illustrative way to show this is just a few graphs that were part of our paper. We show the survival function of parental leave. So at time 0, everyone is on parental leave. And then as time goes on, people slowly start to exit out of parental leave back to employment. And so when we look at the two lines, the red line is the post-PPL line, the blue dashed line is the pre-PPL line. And so what we see is that at first, the women who had received or were eligible for the paid parental leave returned more slowly. So they took, they benefited, they sort of took up the opportunity to take longer leave that was now paid for through the paid parental leave. Then about half a year down the track, we see this sort of turnaround point where the lines cross and women start to return more quickly. So by the end of the year, a larger proportion of women under the paid parental leave scheme have returned to work than would have returned to work before the paid parental leave was introduced. So this is real sort of interesting dual impact of allowing women to take more time, but at the same time making it more likely for them to actually return to work more quickly after the first half year. And so the financial payment obviously helped sort of the larger take-up of leave after birth. But the quicker return of women is more difficult to pinpoint. So our suggested evidence is that it looks like it's around women feeling valued and like employers were supposed to keep in touch with their employees during the leave period and sort of trying to keep that connection between the employee and the employer. And so that's an area that this particular research cannot provide sort of hard evidence on, and this is the area that I think would be really interesting to try and understand better. So what is important for women to decide to return back to work after the maternity leave, and what factors decide whether they return to their own employer or to another employer. When we look at this same survival function for a group, like for different groups of women, so high income versus low income, then you can see that the low income group on the right-hand side was affected more. So for them, this additional payment was more important in enabling them to take up additional time off after having a child. But they also returned more quickly after about half a year. So that seems to be the same for most of the groups that we look at. So we also looked at the women that already had employer paid leave versus those who had no employer paid leave. And so obviously the ones that had no employer paid leave benefited more because they didn't already have financial support to take maternity leave after childbirth. But what's really interesting is the really large impact that the quicker return, like the really, let me rephrase that. So for them, for the ones that had no employer paid leave beforehand, the speeding up of returning to work after about 6 months was greater than for those who already had employer paid leave. So there is something about the universal paid leave that encouraged women to return to work, as well as take up the additional time. The final picture I just wanted to show, because I think it's a really striking one. It's for a relatively small group of women. It's for the women who were self-employed before their child was born. And so when we compare them to the ones that were an employee, there's a very clear difference in the speed of returning to work. So when you're self-employed, basically, if you're not working, there's no income. And so the return, especially before the PPL was introduced, was really, really fast. So these women didn't take much time off at all. The paid parental leave actually allowed them to take some time off. And so you can see there's a huge difference between the pre and post PPL. So for this group of women, the paid parental leave really brought a lot of benefits. And this also came out through the qualitative interviews that another team within the evaluation helped with women, where self-employed women sort of indicated how difficult it was to not work when you're self-employed, and how paid parental leave really made a difference for them. So when we sort of try to sort of pull all this together, all the results, our conclusions were that relatively short, moderately paid leave periods are really an effective tool, which increase the time spent at home. And that could facilitate, for example, 6 months of breastfeeding, which is important for the health of the child and for the health of the mother. And 6 months is really sort of recommended by the World Health Organization as well. And we also sort of find that these paid leave periods also seem to help maintain a relationship with the employer, which could lead to better retention of skills and human capital for women who have a child and take a short break. So we find that when we look at who benefits the most, that the mothers without the employer-funded leave before this paid parental leave was introduced, and generally mothers on lower wages and who had lower skills benefited the most. And so the policy, this really supports the less advantaged mothers and babies who are less likely to have access to employer-funded paid leave. And I think this is really important as well to note. I just want to talk very, very briefly about labour supply and childcare. So I've done some research in this, but it's been a while, and I think I should probably get back to this and sort of revisit it to really understand the current situation. But I did see that there is actually a paper in the program of the Gender Economics Workshop, so I'm looking forward to hear that. So looking back at what we've done in the past, we've done a couple of papers, and also want to mention the work by Bob Brunick and Xiaodong Gong as well, who've done several papers on childcare payments and labour supply as well. And it's perhaps not surprising to anyone that the costs are most important for those who are on low wages, because it really cuts into how much return they get from participating in the labour force. And it cuts particularly hard in low-wage families who have preschool children, again, not surprisingly. And so the group that's most affected when we compare sort of the different demographics is single parents. And again, that's not surprising. If they want to participate in the labour force, they don't have the other parent to sort of share the care to at least some extent with. And every hour that they work, they need to find childcare. And they are more likely to be on lower wages, and it may be very difficult to find affordable childcare that satisfies the needs that they have. this childcare cost is really complicated to try and assess the impact of that, because the impact of childcare costs can be further compounded by the tax rates and income support and family payment withdrawal rates that also play a role. So it's accumulation of taxation, paying for childcare, perhaps some of the income support payments being withdrawn, that can mean that some people don't really get a high return on the hours that they work. And so then it can become very difficult financially to return to the labor market. And because it's at the same time a major effort to do this, so it means that there will be a higher workload for the family. It's very understandable that a lot of women don't return to the labor force in those circumstances, because it's really too hard, too difficult for them to achieve that. And so when you think about subsidizing childcare, that really makes a difference, and especially to disadvantaged families. But you have to think about how are you going to organize this subsidy so that it really benefits those disadvantaged groups. So for example, there has been a time in Australia where there were sort of tax rebates. But that, of course, only benefits those families that actually pay sufficient tax to be rebated. And so when you sort of design a policy like that, you have to really make sure that the group that is most in need has access to it as well. So I know that the childcare subsidies have obviously changed in recent years. And so that is potentially going to have an impact on how well it functions to support families, and how well it supports families on low incomes. And so it's really time for an update to understand the current situation. And as I mentioned, because of all these interactions, it is not necessarily very straightforward and easy. And you do need some type of microsimulation model to try and incorporate sort of the impacts of the various factors together to understand who is benefiting from particular policies. Are the right people benefiting the most from a policy? Does it have an impact on female participation, as well as on poverty and inequality within the population? And so it is actually really difficult to design a childcare subsidy that fulfills all of that, except if you would pay for it all. But that is often seen as too expensive. So in some Scandinavian countries, childcare is made available for very low cost or no cost for some families. And that would be a major investment in those young families, in the children, but also in their parents. So when we look more generally at labor supply and looking at the impact on children, I mean, there's been a huge number of papers that look at the impact of children on female labor supply. And the usual findings are that there are strong impacts for family labor supply and really none for male labor supply. So we sort of look at the two groups and look at the impact, for example, of preschool children, which is the group of children obviously that needs the most childcare, and where parents are most affected when they're thinking about returning to the labor force. Things have changed. I mean, over the past few decades, there have been very clear changes in the labor force participation of women in Australia and across the world. But it is still the case that women are working much less as soon as children arrive. I just wanted to show this table as a small illustration of what has changed. So when we look at this table, I have I'm presenting the participation hours worked elasticities in 94-95, and then in 2015-16 by demographic group. And when we look at 94-95, when we go across the row, we look for partnered men, nothing much changes. It doesn't really matter whether they have children or not. It changes a little bit from 94, 95 to 2015, 16, but not hugely. For partnered women and for single parents, however, we see huge differences, particularly for single parents. So the elasticity was much higher in 94, 95, which indicates that they were working much less. And so their additional hours would sort of create a really large elasticity. When we look in 2015, 16, they still have relatively high elasticities, but it's much lower than it was in 94, 95. So there has been a huge change, but there is still a really big difference. And one result that I was really surprised by was that impacts remain even for extremely highly educated women. So they are smaller than for the general population, but they're still there. And so in the past few years, I've been looking at the labor supply of medical doctors, and arguably they are the group in the labor force that probably invest the most in their education. I mean, it's a really long pathway towards becoming a fully qualified doctor. So you really have invested a lot in your human capital. When we look at labor supply for male and female medical doctors, and we distinguish between general practitioners and specialists, where the specialists, they have a few additional years on top of the general practitioners that they invest in their education. Then we find that even for this extremely highly educated population, differences between men and women persisted very strongly. And so when we look at women who had children of preschool age, they worked around 11 hours per week less as a result. And we also find that female doctors still take primary responsibility for childcare. So in a survey to the doctors, we asked around sort of the hours worked, but also whether they were restricted in the hours worked in some way. And the interesting result, like the interesting outcome that sort of shines through this, is that female doctors stated their hours worked are restricted more by childcare than their partner's hours worked. While for male doctors, their hours worked are much less restricted by childcare than their partner's hours worked. And these doctors, female and male, are equally highly educated. But it's still the female doctors, the women, that feel the primary responsibility for childcare. So another interesting result from this sort of strand of work was that general practitioners were better able to accommodate work-family balance than specialists. And so one of the things that was interesting to see is that in younger generations, women were starting to become the majority of the GP population, because it seemed to accommodate what they wanted from work. So they were much better able to access part-time work. And when we look at specialties, we heard a lot of anecdotal evidence around particular types of specialties that were very difficult for women because part-time didn't really exist. If you had a child, you could maybe take a little bit of time off, but you were expected to come back full-time, either at work or to finish your education. And so that makes it really difficult to take maternity leave or to work part-time. And as a result, women seem to be selecting out of particular specialties. I think that's a loss to that occupation, that really capable women are not choosing a particular specialty because they cannot really work out a way to have a family and to balance their family and their work into the future. So very quickly, I see that my time is moving, as always, quicker than expected. So when we look at the gendered COVID impacts, I mean, there has been a lot about it in the media. young people and women were really affected to a much larger extent than anyone else. And so that's no different for Australia, but also for the Netherlands. We find very similar impacts. So we looked at Dutch administrative data, and these graphs are looking at a population of people who worked in February 2020. And then we just look at what happened just before and then after, up to the end of the year. And we compare that to the same patterns for people who worked in February 2019. And so what you look at here is men and women separately, and then essential workers and non-essential workers separately. So as expected, the essential workers in most countries were basically the ones that could continue working and needed to continue working to keep the economy going, or healthcare continuing. You see not much difference for the essential workers between men and women, but when we look at non-essential workers, the women were much more affected than the men, both in hours worked and in sort of their employment. And in the Netherlands, like in many other countries, you had two waves of COVID. So you had the one that happened sort of around March, April, May, and then you had the second one sort of towards October, when the northern winter started. And in both periods, you can see this really big drop. What we see in the Netherlands was that single parents, and especially mothers with preschool children, were affected the most. And I guess that's sort of not surprising. Similar impacts are probably seen around the world because homeschooling became a feature, childcare centers closed. When we look at the overall picture, so if we looked at essential and non-essential workers combined, we wouldn't see these huge differences that we see here. And that's largely because women are much more likely to be an essential worker than men, and because essential workers were less affected. On average, men and women were quite similarly affected if you didn't take into account the difference between essential and non-essential workers. And I think that's really important to actually distinguish as well, that there's sort of two very separate groups of workers in this case. So for Australia, we had a look using ABS data and the Melbourne Institute's Taking the Pulse of the Nation. And as I mentioned before, we find what everyone else finds as well, obviously, that the largest impacts are on women and young people, that parents are more likely to face reduced hours, whereas singles are more likely to become unemployed, that single mothers had the highest financial stress, and that's partly because they already are in a more precarious and vulnerable position before the start of COVID. And for Australia, there was a real big difference, obviously, between Victoria and the rest of Australia, because Victoria was so much more hit by the COVID in 2020. And what was really clear was that regional Victoria, but also regional areas in other states were affected more than the metropolitan areas, and especially for women there as well. And so I think that when we're thinking about, skip this one, it's a bit too much detail. When we're thinking about what needs to be done to support people, I think Risse, Leonora, and Angela Jackson gave a really good argument for gender responsive budgeting. I think when we look at the COVID impacts by gender, and they give a very nice and extensive overview for Australia, it is really important to look at what the impacts are for men and women. This COVID, there was a really big divergence between men and women in terms of the impact the crisis had on them. So I talked about Barbara's paper, and I think that there's a really interesting insight as well that really warrants further investigation. And it's clear that the COVID crisis has posed some really unique challenges, where we sort of had essential, non-essential job classifications, we had homeschooling, and we had childcare centers. And that really was a challenge for many people, and particularly families with young children. But to sort of be a little bit ending up on a more optimistic note is that it also opens up new opportunities. And with the Life Course Center, we banded together with a number of chief investigators and wrote something that was forward-looking and trying to sort of look for the silver lining of all the difficulties that have arisen from the COVID crisis. So some of the silver lining could be that working from home has now become more acceptable, and maybe that will provide more flexibility in the future. And perhaps men have become more closely connected to family life by being immersed by it over the period of the lockdowns. And so I think this is a really interesting area to sort of have a look at more closely in a couple of years' time and see how it develops and whether some of these challenges actually turn into opportunities for the future. So looking at what I'm sort of currently involved in, so one of the projects I'm looking at is at a 3-year-old kinder in Victoria that's been introduced from 2020 and slowly will sort of increase, so that by the time of 2029, there should be around 15 hours of funded kindergarten for all Victorian children. And so this is a really interesting development because obviously this could be really good for children and for parents. It could be potentially a complement to childcare. For low income families, it's free. It should provide high quality care as well as educational activities. And so it would be really interesting to see whether this creates additional opportunities for families to participate in the labor force, whether it makes it easier for them to return to the labor force because they have like a little block of, I guess it's not childcare, but the children are looked after for that time. And whether that will sort of have an impact on their ability to return to work. So this is very early days, but this is something that over the next few years will hopefully provide some additional insights. And we can then sort of look at how an extra year of early childhood education might complement childcare and how it could benefit children and their parents' ability to participate in the labor force. So that's something that I'm very keen on looking at into the future with Yiping, Sarah and Jeff and others in the education department. So another project that we're currently looking at, which is together with Barbara Broadway and Danya, is to look at what happens with men and women with and without children as they separate, to try and work out what type of factors might protect against poor outcomes, how impacts differ between men and women, how it differs for people who have children or have had children and those who haven't, and whether choices and circumstances before the divorce, how they can affect the outcomes after divorce, to try and think about ways to support families better. I guess so that when things like a relationship breakdown occur, families can better cope with it. Both men and women can sort of move on after a divorce in a way that doesn't lead them to end up in poverty or financial vulnerable. And so not surprisingly, as you would expect, the very early result to be getting is that pre-separation employment really strongly protects women against poverty after separation. If you're not employed before you separate, it can be really, it takes time before you can re-enter, and especially if you've been out of the labor market for a few years, it can be really difficult to sort of start up your career again. So what should we do next? I think there's several things that we could be doing. I think there's not just the one thing. So I think that about 10 years ago, a really important step forward in Australia was universal paid parental leave. And this, I believe, had very strong positive impacts, especially for disadvantaged workers. So can we extend this PPL scheme in duration and generosity? If we would do something like that, I believe that would make the sharing between parents more feasible. 18 weeks is a very short amount of time to be sharing because biologically speaking, women do need a certain amount of time after childbirth. And so 18 weeks is a little bit on the short side to allow, I guess, the fathers and mothers to equally share sort of the parental paid leave that's available. it would be really great if a dedicated fathers component that's more than 2 weeks could be introduced, so that they actually is an encouragement to participate more in the caring role, and maybe a policy where it's like a use it or lose it approach, like a lot of the Scandinavian countries do. We need to think about access to affordable childcare, because paid parental leave is great, but when that stops and you want to return to work, you need to be able to rely on affordable and high quality childcare. And so maybe extending early childhood education, integrating this with childcare could be one way. So it will be really interesting to see what the impact of 3-year-old in Victoria is, and whether that can sort of provide any levers. So we need to really ensure that we can evaluate the impacts of new policies, so that we can ensure effective use of resources and then improve and fine-tune sort of the existing policies. And I guess for that, access to data and ideally sort of administrative data, which would sort of provide the numbers that we need, is really important. And so my final slide, so hopes for future research. Well, I hope that I will be able to continue contributing to this area over the next 10 years of my remaining research life. And I guess my focus is on disadvantage and contributing evidence to the policy debate. I'm really passionate about that. I really enjoy being part of that process, and I hope that I will still have opportunities to provide evidence. I hope that many colleagues will join me in this, and it looks like many of you already are. I can see that a lot of work has been done already. And when I look through the program for today and tomorrow, I see so many really interesting papers in this area, and I look forward to hearing more about all these research projects. The keynote of tomorrow by Núria on gender gaps and social norms, and the Policy Symposium also sound very exciting. I think are really important to sort of try and bring together, I guess, the research and sort of the policy makers and the policy designers to really think about what the next steps could be to reach some of that better sharing of paid and caring work. And I look very much forward to gaining plenty of new knowledge over the next 2 days. Thanks very much for tuning in, and I'll stop sharing. So I have references as well, but if people are interested, I'm very happy to make the slides available.
Thank you, Guyonne. That was wonderful. That was everything you would wish for a keynote. It's illuminating, it's timely, it's informative, it's generous. Thank you for the shout out. It helps us to understand what's working in the policy space. It provokes our thinking, and it's also looking at those silver linings, as you say. We have some time now for some questions. I'm conscious there are some questions that are more about clarification questions, and I would suggest that perhaps those people could have a look at your paper for those types of details. We'll use this time to talk about some of those policy dynamics that you've alluded to. Some of the questions do refer to what we call in economics that intensive or extensive margin. It's not just about women's labour force participation, but it's also about, once they're in the workforce, how many hours are they working, and are there penalties for extending those hours. And if I could tie together some of these questions and come back to effective marginal tax rates. For everyone listening in, we know that effective marginal tax rates are effectively how much extra income people are sort of basically handing back to the government for those additional days of work. Once you factor in means testing, the tapering of family benefits and the extra childcare out-of-pocket cost. You said it was difficult. It's difficult to come up with the right type of answer here, what needs to be done to design a good childcare subsidy policy. Because effective marginal tax rates, we know, is associated with women really reducing their labour market hours and being more likely to be working part-time rather than full-time. Do you have a sense of what part of that overall package of policy levers would be worth focusing on? Like, what is the ingredient in those effective marginal tax rates which needs to be properly adjusted in order to remove the financial penalty that second income earners experience if they increase their hours work? Like, where would you start if you were talking to a policymaker?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to do is to look at at the different groups. So it will be different for women with different family income and different individual income. And so I think you really need a picture of how much, what the marginal effective tax rate is for the different groups. Mm-hmm. And then decide which group you want to focus on the most, because when you sort of make it better for one group, you often make it worse for another, unless you're really going to be very generous and say, okay, let's just pay for so much, I mean, like a certain number of hours of childcare for everyone, regardless, and not try to sort of withdraw it as people earn more. So you really need to sort of look at the populations that are sort of on the margin of, I guess, either participating, not participating, or working sort of relatively low part-time hours, and look at what you would need to change in the system to get better incentives for them. Mm. So perhaps, yeah. So I think compartmentalizing, I guess, the population in some way, to look at where, I guess, where the impacts are the worst, to sort of say, okay, what do we need to do to make the impacts less there? And I think that's particularly important if you don't want to, sort of make it free for all, then I think, yeah, you really need to look at the groups that need it the most. And I think that was why I sort of said, like, targeting to the right people. Mm-hmm. It's sort of the way you make it available is really important as well. So I think there's sort of different, like you have the childcare subsidy in itself, and then you sort of have other things that can sort of make it better. And so I guess you need to bring all the different parts together and look how they add up, to see where the pain is, I guess. And at the moment, I don't have as good grip on it. And that's why I was saying I should really sort of get back to this. I've done work in the past, which was really, I thought was really insightful, but that's old, and I guess things have really moved on. So I think we really need to sort of look at it again. And I know people have looked very closely at the effective marginal tax rates before the latest change in childcare subsidies. And that was where they really found sort of like the fourth and the fifth day were sort of very painful. Basically, if you would start working those days, some families would not really get ahead. Mm-hmm. And then you make it financially sort of non-viable to sort of increase your hours to that level. And I think you want to avoid those. I think you really want to avoid sort of those instances where if you work more, you don't get a return to it, especially when it's sort of in the part-time hours. I mean, if you're working 50, 60 hours, I'm not that worried, but if you're working 20 hours and an extra hour doesn't really return much income to you, then I think that's a real problem, because that's clearly a hurdle. And when you're sort of balancing family work and there's sort of lots of demands on your time already, you're not going to work for zero additional income. I mean, I think you would need to be extremely dedicated to and forward looking to sort of say, okay, no, I'm sort of going to work more because it will benefit me in 2-3 years time. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Guyonne, for those insights and your wisdom there. I think from your experience of being involved in conducting these policy evaluations for many years, your wisdom there about making sure we have a nuanced approach and we consider different cohorts and we don't bundle everyone up in the same bucket. It is very valuable insight for us all to take away. And it also relates to not just targeting who is most disadvantaged, but there is a comment here from Janani William, who has said, what about higher income earning women who may be effectively penalised for earning too much, and that speaks to the high opportunity cost of high income earning women. Janini hasn't actually asked a question there. She's just made that important point. I think we're really close to time, and it's hard to be able to squeeze in any further questions. But Guyonne, do you have a chance to have a look at the questions and maybe pick one that you would like to answer in the last minute or so that we have here?
Okay, so I think the only one I can really quickly answer would be the first one, which is sort of a clarifying question. The other ones would take me too long to do. So housework is really sort of, so the inside housework was really all the, like the cleaning, the washing, the cooking, and then sort of like doing things like errands, like shopping, going to the bank, etc. And then the outside housework is the gardening and sort of painting or things, maintenance type things outside of the home. So it's collected by asking people how much time per week. So it's a very rough time use question. So it's asking just how many hours per week do you usually spend on sort of a number of different tasks. So it's sort of work, like in paid work, in sort of those different types of housework, and sort of in childcare. And people just sort of respond to one number, and that's what I've used. And so I guess there's a group of people that are really passionate about the time use data, and I think that's actually really important. I mean, the Hilda fills a gap here, but it's not the same detail. So it's a fairly roughly measure of it.
Thank you, Guyonne, for that clarification. We've come to the end of our allocated time, unfortunately, and there are so many really important questions there that I think we're going to keep, and we're probably going to discuss further and maybe give to our participants at the Policy Symposium. Can borrow some of these questions. I think they're really thought-provoking and important. So please know that we appreciate those questions that have come in. According to the program, we have a 30-minute break now. We want to make sure we give everyone that chance to stretch and rejoin us in 30 minutes. Please note that for the next session, you'll need to join us using a different Zoom link, and that will have been sent to you in your registration. Finally, thank you very much again, Guyonne, and I wish everyone here a very productive, enlightening and inspiring workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonora.